Thanks for watching my video. If you like, hit the subscribe button. Today we're going to replace the front tire on a 2014 VFR DLX. First thing we're going to do is, with the 14mm wrench, we are going to remove our front calipers. This is a pretty easy job, pulling the front wheel off. It is much easier if you remove the back wheel first. That way you can get that front wheel up in the air high enough to get the wheel out from under the fender. So the first bolt's out of the caliper. Now we're working on the top bolt. If the last guy that wrenched on your bike used torque specs, then these bolts are very easy to remove. So there you go, there are the two bolts out, and what I typically do is when I grab the caliper, I give it a little twist and it separates those pads just far enough so they slide off. And as you can see, I have EBC HH pads on my bike. That's typically the first mod that I do. When I buy a new bike, I go through the whole bike and make the bike my own. So when I bought this bike, it had about 4,000 miles on it, but the brakes felt terrible. So I went ahead and put the EBC HH on here, and there was a huge improvement, as you always get from EBC pads. So now we're over on the right side. We've just removed the top bolt and we're working on the bottom bolt. And it's going to be the same method for this side as for the other. I just grab that caliper, I give it a little twist, and that separates those pads just enough so I can slide it past the rotor and not bang into the wheel with the caliper. So I just let my calipers hang out of the way, and then with my 22mm socket, I go ahead and I break the axle bolt free. So now that I've got this axle bolt free, now I can loosen my pinch bolts. Some people call them pinch bolts, some people call them cinch bolts, but these are just the bolts that pinch the bottom of the fork onto the axle so your axle doesn't work its way out. Now the easiest way to do this with the back wheel off is I'm using a pit bull front wheel stand, and when I push down, it just pushes the bike up in the air, and if the back tire was on, the bike would not go up. So there you have it. You see how low the swing arm is to the ground, and this is the same method that you would use for pretty much any sport touring bike with a center stand. Take the rear wheel off first and then start working on the front wheel. So once I have the bike up in the air, I'll finish removing the front axle bolt, and you'll notice once you get the axle slid out of the left fork, you'll see a hole in the axle, and you can stick a screwdriver or anything. I'm using a Torx driver through that hole, and it allows you to slide that axle out pretty easily. So there you go. There's the axle out of the bike. When you pull your wheel out, best thing to do is the left spacer goes on the left side of the bike, the right spacer goes on the right side of the bike. And now it's time to change the tires. So let's move on to the next shop. Alright, so now we're in my workshop where my tire machines are, and we are removing the Schrader valve out of the valve stem to let the air out. If you haven't already, it's a good idea to replace that rubber valve stem with a 90-degree aluminum valve stem. It makes checking your tire pressure a lot easier in the mornings, and it's much more affordable down the road. You should always replace your rubber valve stem at every tire change. A lot of shops don't do that. When I do tires for people, I charge $20 a wheel, and every bike leaves out of here with the 90-degree valve stem. Pretty much everybody comes back to get tires done by me the second time, third time, fourth time. So it's cheaper for me to put a 90-degree valve stem in the first time they come, and then it's only 10 cents every time after that. So they kind of pay for themselves. So I just put the tire on the machine, and just so you can see, when the clamp clamps down, sometimes it'll grab the edge of the tire. So I just wanted you to see that the clamp did not clamp onto the tire, and it did grab the wheel, the rim, like it should. Then I move my arm into place, and I take my tire iron and pry the tire up over the duckbill. On my machine, the clamp has plastic nylon on the clamps that hold the rim to the machine, and then my duckbill is a softer plastic nylon. And the only way that you can scratch a wheel with my machine is the tire iron that I'm using, and I do try to be very careful and make sure that my tire iron does not get near the rim. That way I'm not scratching up somebody's wheel. I know I don't like to have my wheels scratched, so I try to protect other people's as well. Then we want to look at the arrow on the tire and compare it to the arrow on the wheel. Usually there's an arrow on the wheel or an arrow on the brake rotor that you can see that tells you the direction. And then I'm taking my lube, and I'm going to lube up the bead of the tire, and I'm going to lube up the bead of the rim. It just makes the tire seat faster, and I'm using a product called Slip and Seal. So these are Michelin PR5s that I'm putting on this bike. It's a wives' tale that there's supposed to be a dot. They say with Michelin's, you're supposed to line the barcode up with the valve stem. But if you go onto TireRack.com, they got a pretty good write-up of the fake news, which is the dot on the tire. It's your bike, you decide. I typically do it so the dot matches the valve stem. That way when somebody leaves out of here, if some jerk on the side of the road sees that the dot doesn't match up, they won't hassle the guy that I did tires for. But that's the only reason. It's because there's a lot of uneducated motorcycle riders on this planet. So I just seated the bead, both sides. You want to check and make sure that the bead is in place. But we did hear 2 pops, and now I'm getting a new Schrader valve. And like I said, anytime you change tires, you should put in a new rubber valve stem or a new Schrader valve every time. With the 90-degree, it's going to be a new Schrader valve. So that's now in place. And now I'm going to bring the tire pressure up to the 36. Your Honda manufacturer recommends 36 on the front, 40 on the rear. If you argue with Honda, just remember, they put millions of dollars into figuring out what the best tire pressure is for their bikes. You did not. So they probably know better than you, and you should probably go with the tire pressure that's on the swing arm. So always, 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 once you put air into your tire, make sure that you put the cap back onto the valve. You can get dirt into that valve and it'll slowly leak out, so you don't want that. So here we are on to step 3. Now we're going to balance the wheel. So this is my Mac Daddy Derek Weaver computer balancer. If you go to the derekweaver.com website, they have a bunch of different computer balancer options. This one is going to be the biggest one you can buy from them. And I got this one just because I do so many tires. It's just worth my while. I actually had this machine actually started paying for itself in the first 6 months of ownership. So that's pretty good. That tells you how many tires that I do a year out of my home garage. This is just my side hustle, so don't think that I'm a business or anything. So what we're doing right now is there's a little arm that comes out and you put that on the bead, and that tells the machine that it's 17 inches. And then the width of the rim, it's a 3.5 inch rim. And then we bring the cover down and the machine starts spinning the wheel. And when it stops, it's ready to go. So there it's asking for a 1/2 ounce. However, there's 3/4 of an ounce on the wheel right now. So we're going to take that 3/4 of an ounce off. And then when we spin it again, you'll see that it'll ask us for another ounce. So right there, I just moved the wheel to where it's asking for a 1/2. And that would be at the top right there. But now if we look at the wheel, we can see that there's wheel weights already on there. So we're going to take a Mondo putty knife and we're going to scrape those old wheel weights off the wheel and spin it again. So now that it's done, it's asking me for an ounce. And I've said this before in other videos. Typically when you balance a wheel, so see it's asking for an ounce, but typically when you balance a wheel, the wheel weight almost always goes in the same place. There used to be a day back in time that I would balance the wheel without the tire on it. I had red wheel weights, and I would put the red wheel weights where the wheel was out of balance and bring the wheel to 100%. And then when I wanted to balance the wheel, I could put the tire on the wheel and put it on the machine. And it would only take about a 1/4 ounce somewhere else on the wheel to balance it out properly. In my old age, I've gotten lazy and I just put extra weight on the wheel wherever the machine tells me to. So where I'm sticking this 3/4 or this 1 ounce of weight, in the past there was 3/4 in the same place. I could tell that from the tape that was on the wheel. So once we've got our 1 ounce in place, we'll drop our hood and give the wheel one last spin. Computer balancers really take the thought process out of balancing tires. I couldn't imagine going back to a day when I was using a static balancer and just trying to spin the wheel on my workbench and wait for it to finally get to the heavy spot and then figure out what size weight needed to be on it. It was just too time consuming. I do so many tires that I want to get you in and out of my shop as fast as possible. Get your tires off, get the new tires on, put your bike back together, and send you back out to the mountains to go play. So now when I put the bike back together, I'm going to use Lubrimatic marine grease. You use whatever grease that you want to use, but keep this in mind. We're putting the front wheel or rear wheel back on a motorcycle. The axle doesn't need any lubrication. If you think that you need to put the highest performance grease on your axle, you're borderline idiot. Your axle just holds the wheel on the front of the bike. It needs no lubrication to spin. Remember, your wheel spins on the bearings, not on the axle. So look at your axle. If you have like burn marks on your axle, if it's not clean and smooth like my axle is, then you've got a bearing problem, and you probably should think about replacing some bearings, because that means that your bearing is actually spinning on your axle, and that's bad. So yeah, any good grease, I use Lubrimatic marine grease, because if it keeps the water out of your boat trailer bearings, it's going to do a great job of keeping the water out of your front wheel. So I put a light coat inside the seal on the left side. Now I'm going to jump over to the right side. I clean off that spacer, and then I'm just going to put a very light coat of grease on that little beveled edge inside the wheel seal. And it's kind of hard to see it in the video, but once you pull your bike apart, you'll see that there's like two lips, an inner lip and an outer lip, that seal that spacer into the wheel. So I just put a light coat of grease in there, and what that grease will do is any moisture that the seal isn't keeping out of the wheel, the marine grease will keep that moisture out of your wheel. Next step, we're just going to lift the wheel up, line it up with that axle, and then push the axle through and send it home. So our front wheel's back on the bike. We're going to put our axle bolt back into the axle. We're only going finger tight. Don't torque it down yet. If you're following along with your manual, there's some steps, and there's a bunch of other geniuses out on the interwebs who are always trolling videos, or out in the forums, who know it all. They just know everything. You know who I'm talking about, especially if you're a VFR owner and you're on some of the VFR forums. You know who those guys are, who put about 100 miles on their VFR every year, but they know everything there is to know about the VFR and riding it and how to take it apart, but they really don't know the VFR. Just keyboard jockeys who think they're all that in a bag of chips. So what we're going to do first, once we get that axle bolt in there hand tight, just snug is all. We don't want to tighten it up all the way. Next, we're going to put our calipers on, and we're going to set our torque specs. I don't give out torque specs in my video. That's in your manual, so I'm going to tell you to refer to your manual for that one. I always torque 3, so I hear it click 3 times for each bolt. And then we move over to the other side. So we just slide our caliper on. And on these forks, there's actually a, I don't even know what you would call it, like a little pedestal coming off the fork tube that your caliper clips into, and it'll hold that caliper in place without having the bolts in. So it makes it really easy to line the bolts up and put the bolts back into the bike. So the trick to this is once we get both calipers on and get them torqued down, some manuals say that you should jump up and down on the bike and force the forks down and that aligns everything. Well, it's kind of nonsense. So once you have it torqued down, the easiest way to align everything, and most of us, especially you guys that are watching this, who have been to the racetrack at least once in your life and spent some track time, know that once you put the front end together, if you give the wheel a good spin and grab some brake, as I'm doing, when that wheel comes to a stop, that stop is going to align. That's going to make sure that everything's aligned. And if you spin the wheel again, you can hear it. You can hear the rotor going around inside the caliper. If it sounds uniform as the wheel goes around, everything is in alignment. So once that's done, then I go ahead and I tighten down my 22 millimeter axle bolt, and it's going to pull the axle all the way into place. And then I'm going to go over to the left side with my torque wrench, and I'm going to torque down that pinch bolt on the left. And then I'm going to come back to the right side and I'm going to torque down my axle bolt. When the axle bolt's torqued down, now I'm going to do the pinch bolt on the right, and I'm going to torque it into place. And with that being done, this wheel should still be in alignment, and you can hear it. I'm telling you, when you spin the wheel, it should sound the same as the wheel spins around the bike. So here's what it looks like with the front wheel on. We're going to drop it off that pit bull stand. And you see how much more room that swing arm went up. So when I put the back wheel on, it'll be pretty easy. So thanks for watching. I hope this was informative for you.